You people need to learn your place and stop causing trouble. Those 10 words spoken with the casual cruelty of a man who believed his wealth made him untouchable would destroy Brandon Mitchell's life in exactly 47 minutes. But as he stood in the aisle of American Airlines Flight 447 pointing an accusing finger at the quiet black woman in seat 12A, he had absolutely no idea that Dr. Amara Williams could end his career with 3 simple words. I own this. What Brandon didn't know, what none of the 147 passengers on that Boeing 737-800 knew, was that the woman he was about to humiliate in the most public way possible wasn't just another traveler. She was the founder and CEO of Skybridge Airlines, the fastest-growing airline in America and Technova Corporation's largest corporate travel client. His company's $12 million annual travel budget flowed directly through her company, and in less than an hour, she would personally cancel every single dollar of it. This isn't just a story about karma catching up with a workplace bully. This is about the terrifying moment when decades of unchecked privilege collided headfirst with consequences at 35,000 feet. It's about what happens when the wrong person says the wrong thing to someone who has the power to make it the last wrong thing they ever say in their career. Before we dive into this devastating takedown that left an entire cabin in stunned silence, tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed workplace bullying? Have you seen someone's true character emerge when they thought no one important was watching? If stories about karma and justice hit different for you, smash that subscribe button right now because what you're about to witness will leave you absolutely speechless. But let me rewind and show you exactly how we got here, because the events that led to Brandon Mitchell's complete and total destruction began 3 hours earlier in the bustling corridors of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Dr. Amara Williams moved through Terminal 3 with the quiet confidence of someone who had built an empire from scratch. At 38, she was the founder and CEO of Skybridge Airlines, but you wouldn't know it from looking at her. She wore simple dark jeans, a Northwestern University sweatshirt, and comfortable sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her only jewelry was a modest watch and small gold earrings. To anyone observing her in the crowded terminal, she looked like what she was pretending to be, just another passenger catching a morning flight. This was intentional. 4 times a year, Amara conducted what she called ghost flights, traveling on competitor airlines under a slightly modified version of her name to experience air travel through her customers' eyes. Today's mission was American Airlines Flight 447 from Chicago to Los Angeles, and she had deliberately booked the worst possible seat, a middle seat in premium economy, surrounded by the type of business travelers who often revealed their true character when they thought they were dealing with regular people. As the owner of an airline, Amara could have flown first class on her own aircraft any time she wanted. But these undercover trips were research gold. She discovered which flight attendants went above and beyond when no executives were watching. She tested Wi-Fi speeds, tasted the food her competitors served, and observed how staff handled difficult situations. Most importantly, she witnessed the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that travelers treated each other when they thought their behavior had no consequences. Sitting near gate B-17, Amara checked her phone one final time before boarding. Her assistant had sent the latest numbers. Skybridge's customer satisfaction ratings were up 12% this quarter, largely because of changes she'd implemented from previous ghost flights. But the message that caught her attention was different. Technova discrimination lawsuit filed this morning. Legal says they have strong evidence of company-wide bias. Thought you should know before your flight. Technova. The name made her jaw tighten slightly. She knew the company well too well. They were Skybridge's third-largest corporate client, generating over $12 million in annual revenue. But more than that, Technova had been on her radar for months due to concerning reports from her staff about how their executives treated Skybridge employees, particularly women and people of color. Several flight attendants had filed complaints about inappropriate comments and dismissive behavior from Technova travelers. The irony wasn't lost on her. 23 years ago, Amara had been a young MBA traveling to her first major job interview when a hotel manager in Atlanta had looked her up and down and said, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" This establishment caters to a different clientele. That moment of humiliation had planted the seed for what would become Skybridge Airlines. She had sworn that no one under her watch would ever be made to feel like they didn't belong. Now, scrolling through her phone, she saw that Technova was finally facing legal consequences for the culture of discrimination that she had been quietly documenting. Former employees were coming forward with stories of bias in hiring promotion and daily treatment. The lawsuit alleged a pattern of behavior that went from the top down, creating an environment where prejudice wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. A voice over the terminal's speaker system interrupted her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, American Airlines Flight 447 to Los Angeles is now ready for boarding. We'll begin with our first class and business class passengers, followed by our Platinum Elite members." Amara looked up to see the chaos that always accompanied boarding announcements. Business travelers rushed to form a line, wheeling their expensive luggage with the urgency of people who believed their time was more valuable than everyone else's. And that's when she saw him. The man was impossible to miss, not because of his appearance, though his perfectly tailored charcoal suit and gleaming Rolex certainly stood out, but because of his voice. He was speaking loudly into his Bluetooth earpiece, pacing back and forth in front of the gate with the aggressive energy of someone performing for an audience. "No, you listen to me, Marcus," the man said, his voice carrying clearly across the seating area. "You tell the client that Technova's Q3 projections are not a suggestion. They're a goddamn promise. If they can't handle our terms, we walk. We are the shark in that tank, not the guppy. Got it?" The shark. Several passengers looked up from their phones and magazines, annoyed by the volume and tone. The man seemed to feed off the attention, speaking even louder as he continued his conversation. "And another thing, I want you to handle the situation with HR. You know what I'm talking about. The diversity hire complaints. Just pay them off and make them disappear. These people always want money. It's cheaper than fighting it, and we can't afford the publicity right now." Amara's eyes narrowed as she processed what she was hearing. This was Brandon Mitchell, Technova's Senior Vice President of Strategic Development. She recognized him from LinkedIn profiles and corporate photos she'd seen while researching the company. He was exactly the type of executive that her flight attendants had complained about, entitled dismissive and apparently comfortable discussing discriminatory practices in a crowded airport terminal. Sir A. Gate Agent had approached Brandon, her voice politely professional despite the obvious discomfort on her face. "We're ready to board our Platinum Elite passengers." Brandon barely glanced at her, holding up one finger while continuing his phone conversation. "I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?" "Some employee is interrupting me." He said the word employee like it tasted bad in his mouth. The gate agent's cheeks flushed, but she maintained her composure. "I just wanted to let you know that we're boarding Platinum Elite members now." "Yeah, obviously," Brandon said, ending his call and shoving his phone into his jacket pocket. "That's what Platinum Elite means. Priority." He brushed past her without another word, not bothering to say thank you or even acknowledge her as a human being. Amara watched the interaction with the analytical eye of someone who had spent years studying customer behavior. This was a man who believed that his frequent flyer status, his expensive clothes, and his corporate title gave him the right to treat service workers as invisible. In her experience, people like Brandon Mitchell revealed their true character not in boardrooms or networking events, but in small moments when they thought no one important was watching. As she waited for her boarding group to be called, Amara pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to her head of legal. "I'm about to interact with Technova executives. Document everything. This could get interesting." The response came back immediately. "Always do. Safe travels, boss." 20 minutes later, as Group 5 was finally called for boarding, Amara joined the line with the mixture of anticipation and dread that always accompanied these ghost flights. She never knew what she would discover about her industry, her competitors, or the darker sides of human nature when people thought they could act without consequences. What she didn't know was that Brandon Mitchell was about to provide her with the most devastating example yet of why her documentation efforts were so necessary. In less than 3 hours, his true character would be exposed to millions of people around the world, and the consequences would be swift, brutal, and absolutely deserved. But first, she had to get on the plane. Brandon Mitchell strode down the jet bridge like he owned the aircraft. At 45, he was the picture of corporate success silver at his temples, a physique maintained by expensive personal trainers, and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no by anyone whose opinion he valued. His Hermes briefcase swung at his side, and his Italian leather shoes clicked against the metal walkway with a rhythm that seemed to announce his importance to anyone within earshot. Behind him, other passengers shuffled forward with the resigned patience of people accustomed to being treated as secondary considerations. But Brandon had never been a secondary consideration to anyone. As Senior Vice President of Strategic Development at Teknova Corporation, he commanded a salary that started with 3 and ended with 7 figures. He flew over 200,000 miles annually, always in premium cabins, always with priority service, always with the kind of deference that money and status could buy. His backstory was the American dream twisted into something darker. Born in suburban Detroit to middle-class parents, Brandon had clawed his way up the corporate ladder through a combination of genuine talent and calculated ruthlessness. He had learned early that in the business world, perception was reality, and the perception he had cultivated was that of a man who got results no matter the cost. At Teknova, a company that manufactured high-end computer components for Fortune 500 companies, Brandon had built his reputation on closing deals that others considered impossible. His methods weren't always pretty, but they were effective. He had a talent for finding leverage personal weaknesses, financial pressures, professional insecurities, and exploiting them until his targets had no choice but to accept his terms. The problem was that Brandon had begun applying these same tactics to his interactions with employees, service workers, and anyone else he considered beneath his station. He had developed a worldview where people fell into 2 categories: those who could advance his interests and those who were obstacles to be moved out of his way. It was a perspective that had been gradually poisoning his relationships, his reputation, and his soul, but it had also made him very wealthy, and in his mind, that justified everything. Today, he was flying to Los Angeles for what he called the Teknova finale, a $50 million deal with a consortium of tech companies that would cement his position as the company's top revenue generator. The contract would make him essentially untouchable within the company hierarchy, or so he believed. What he didn't know was that back in Chicago, federal investigators were serving subpoenas related to the discrimination lawsuit that had been filed that morning, and his name was on several of those documents. As Brandon entered the aircraft, he was greeted by Sophia Ramirez, the lead flight attendant. At 28, Sophia had been with American Airlines for 5 years, and she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read passengers within seconds of meeting them. Her smile was professionally warm, but her dark eyes were constantly assessing, categorizing, and preparing for whatever challenges the next few hours might bring. Sophia had started her career believing that customer service meant making every passenger feel valued and respected. 5 years of dealing with entitled travelers had taught her a more nuanced approach. Most passengers deserved kindness and respect, but some deserved careful management and thorough documentation. She could spot the potential problem passengers from 50 feet away, and everything about Brandon Mitchell screamed problem. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she said, checking his boarding pass. "Welcome aboard. You're in seat 12A today." Brandon barely glanced at her, already reaching for his phone to continue the calls that he believed made him indispensable. "Yeah, fine. I need to make some calls during takeoff. I assume that won't be a problem." Sophia's smile never wavered, but she made a mental note. Passengers who began interactions by assuming rules wouldn't apply to them usually found other rules to ignore as well. "I'll be happy to remind you about our communication policies once we're ready for departure, sir." Behind Brandon, other passengers were boarding with varying degrees of patience and courtesy. The contrast was immediate and stark. Most travelers offered polite greetings, said please and thank you, and treated the flight attendants like the professionals they were. But Brandon's presence seemed to create a bubble of tension that affected everyone around him. Near the back of the boarding line, Maria Santos was making her way toward the aircraft with the nervous energy of someone on her first month in a new job. At 24, Maria was Sophia's protege, a junior flight attendant who had joined American Airlines with dreams of travel and adventure. What she had discovered instead was that air travel brought out both the best and worst in humanity, often within the same flight. Maria had been assigned to work with Sophia specifically because of her mentor's reputation for handling difficult situations with grace and professionalism. Sophia had a talent for de-escalating conflicts before they became incidents, and she had been teaching Maria that the key to successful flight attending wasn't just service, it was psychology. "Watch the passengers during boarding," Sophia had told her during training. "The ones who treat us poorly during the first interaction will usually cause problems later. Document everything, but don't judge. Some people are having the worst day of their lives. Others are just having their regular day, and that tells you everything you need to know about who they are." Today, Maria carried a small notebook where she recorded observations about passenger interactions for her training file. It was a practice that Sophia encouraged among all her trainees not for punitive purposes, but to help new flight attendants recognize patterns and prepare for potential challenges. As the boarding process continued, other key players in the day's drama were finding their seats. In 11A, Robert Martinez was settling in for what he hoped would be a quiet flight to Los Angeles. At 52, Robert was a successful construction contractor who had built his business through hard work, fair dealing, and treating every person he encountered with basic human dignity. He was flying to LA to bid on a major commercial project. But unlike Brandon, he felt no need to announce his importance to everyone within earshot. Robert had grown up in East LA as the son of immigrants, and he had never forgotten what it felt like to be dismissed or underestimated because of his background. He had made it a point throughout his career to treat service workers, employees, and strangers with the kind of respect he had often been denied as a young man. But he was also non-confrontational by nature, preferring to lead by example rather than directly challenge other people's bad behavior. In seat 11C, Lisa Thompson was boarding with the manic energy of someone who had built a career around documenting her life for social media consumption. At 34, Lisa had parlayed her love of travel and photography into a successful Instagram account with 2.3 million followers. She was constantly looking for content, always ready to capture the perfect moment or the interesting story that would engage her audience. Lisa's approach to social media was generally positive. She focused on beautiful destinations, inspiring stories, and uplifting content that made people want to travel and explore the world. But she also had a journalist's instincts for recognizing when something important was happening, and she wasn't afraid to document injustice when she witnessed it. Her followers trusted her to be authentic, and part of that authenticity meant calling out bad behavior when she saw it. As she stowed her camera equipment in the overhead bin, Lisa was already mentally preparing for the flight ahead. She had learned to travel with multiple devices charged and ready because you never knew when life would provide content that was too important to ignore. Behind the scenes, the flight's other crew members were preparing for what they hoped would be a routine trip to Los Angeles. James Parker, a 31-year-old flight attendant, was working his second flight of the day after a red-eye from Denver. James was competent and professional, but he was also conflict-averse, preferring to avoid confrontations rather than address them directly. This approach served him well in most situations, but it sometimes meant that problems escalated beyond the point where they could be easily resolved. In the cockpit, Captain Elena Rodriguez was completing her pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision that had characterized her 20-year career in aviation. At 48, Captain Rodriguez was a former Air Force pilot who had transitioned to commercial aviation after serving 3 tours overseas. She had seen genuine life-and-death situations which gave her a unique perspective on what constituted a real emergency versus typical passenger drama. But Captain Rodriguez also had zero tolerance for discrimination or abuse of any kind. Her military background had taught her that units functioned best when every member was treated with respect and dignity, and she applied the same principles to her aircraft. She had made it clear to her crews that she would support them in any situation where passengers crossed the line from difficult to abusive. As the final passengers boarded and the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, none of these individuals knew that they were about to become witnesses to and participants in one of the most dramatic in-flight confrontations in recent aviation history. They were simply doing their jobs, taking their seats, and preparing for what they assumed would be a routine flight to Los Angeles. But routine flights don't usually include passengers whose careers are about to implode in real time, or CEOs conducting undercover research on their competitors or social media influencers, who are about to live stream a viral moment to millions of viewers around the world. In less than an hour, all of their lives would intersect in ways that none of them could have predicted, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the confines of Flight 447. Dr. Amara Williams approached row 12 with the calm demeanor of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of blending in. She found her assigned seat 12B, the dreaded middle seat sandwiched between Brandon Mitchell in 12A and Robert Martinez in 12C. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. As the CEO of a major airline, she could have been in first class on her own aircraft. But here she was about to experience premium economy from the perspective of an ordinary passenger. Brandon was already settled in the aisle seat, his laptop open and his phone pressed to his ear as he conducted what sounded like another high-stakes business call. He had claimed the shared armrest with the casual entitlement of someone who believed the world existed for his convenience, and his briefcase occupied part of the floor space that should have been available to all 3 passengers in the row. "No, Marcus, you're not listening," Brandon said loudly, his voice carrying clearly to surrounding rows. "I don't care what their feelings are. Feelings don't close deals. Pressure closes deals. You apply pressure until they have no choice but to say yes. That's business 101. Several passengers glanced in his direction with obvious annoyance, but Brandon seemed either oblivious or indifferent to their reactions. He was performing for an audience of one himself. Amara stowed her small carry-on bag in the overhead bin and took her seat immediately, recognizing that this flight was going to provide valuable data about passenger behavior and crew responses to challenging situations. As she buckled her seatbelt, she made a mental note about the cramped conditions in premium economy compared to Skybridge's more generous seat configuration. "Excuse me," Brandon said, ending his call and turning toward Amara for the first time. His eyes did a quick assessment. Plain clothes, no visible luxury. Brands, no obvious markers of wealth or status. In his mental filing cabinet, she immediately went into the category of unimportant person. "You're in the middle seat." "Yes, I am," Amara replied evenly, pulling out a book and settling in for the flight. Brandon frowned as if she had personally created an inconvenience for him. "Right, look. I need the aisle. I'm working the entire flight and I need to be able to get up and move around. Let's swap seats." It wasn't a request. The tone, the phrasing, the expectation written across his face. Everything about his approach indicated that he viewed this as a simple transaction where his needs took precedence over anyone else's preferences. Amara looked at him with the patient expression she had perfected during years of dealing with difficult personalities in the business world. "I'm sorry, but I prefer the middle seat. I specifically requested it when I booked." The response clearly surprised Brandon. In his experience, people in middle seats were eager to trade up to aisle seats. The fact that she had declined his generous offer suggested either stubbornness or stupidity, and he wasn't sure which annoyed him more. "I'm a Platinum Elite flyer," he said, puffing out his chest slightly as if displaying a military decoration. "I spend over $300,000 a year with this airline. That comes with certain expectations and accommodations. The aisle seat is one of them." Other passengers were beginning to notice the conversation. Robert Martinez in the window seat shifted uncomfortably as he realized he was trapped in the middle of what was clearly becoming a conflict. Behind them, Lisa Thompson discreetly raised her phone and began recording her instincts, telling her that this interaction had the potential to become something significant. "I understand your status with the airline," Amara said, her voice remaining maddeningly calm. "But this is the seat I chose and paid for. I'd like to keep it." Brandon's face began to redden slightly. Being publicly contradicted by someone he considered a nobody was an affront to his entire worldview. In boardrooms and business meetings, his combination of financial leverage and aggressive personality usually steamrolled any opposition. But this quiet woman seemed completely unimpressed by his credentials. Sofia Ramirez noticed the developing situation from her position near the front of the cabin. As lead flight attendant, she had developed radar for potential conflicts, and everything about Brandon's body language screamed escalating problem. She approached the row with her practiced professional smile. "Is everything all right here, sir?" she asked, her tone warm but alert. Brandon immediately turned his charm toward her, flashing the smile that had helped close million-dollar deals and convinced business partners to overlook his more aggressive tendencies. "Yes, everything's fine, Sophia." He had read her name tag with the practiced ease of someone who understood that using people's names created a false sense of intimacy. "This passenger and I were just sorting out a little seating arrangement. I need the aisle for business purposes, and I'm sure she won't mind moving to the middle." He looked pointedly at Amara, his expression conveying that she should gracefully accept defeat now that an authority figure was present. The subtext was clear: you've made your point, but now it's time for reasonable people to reach a reasonable accommodation that gives me what I want. Sophia looked at Amara, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. The flight attendant's smile remained in place, but her voice took on a slightly firmer tone. "Sir, I'm afraid that if the passenger doesn't wish to switch seats, I can't compel her to do so. Perhaps I can check to see if another aisle seat becomes available once we've finished boarding." The diplomatic solution was reasonable, professional, and completely unsatisfactory to Brandon's sense of entitlement. Being told that his preferences couldn't be automatically accommodated was bad enough, but being told this in front of other passengers was a public humiliation that his ego couldn't tolerate. "Fine," he snapped, his charm evaporating like morning dew. "Just fine." He threw his briefcase into the overhead bin with unnecessary force, causing other passengers' bags to shift and settle with audible thuds. The violence of the gesture was clearly intended to communicate his displeasure to anyone within visual range. Sophia made a mental note about the incident and moved on to attend to other passengers, but she kept Brandon's row within her peripheral vision. In her experience, passengers who reacted poorly to minor disappointments during boarding often escalated their behavior once the flight was underway, and they felt more anonymous within the confined space of the aircraft. As Brandon squeezed past Robert Martinez to reach the middle seat, he made sure his movements were as disruptive as possible. His shoulder bumped Robert's arm, his briefcase knocked against the seat back, and he settled into 12B with a theatrical sigh that was clearly audible to surrounding passengers. "Unbelievable," he muttered, just loud enough to ensure that both Amara and Robert could hear his commentary. "Some people have no consideration for others." Maria Santos, working her way down the aisle as part of the final boarding process, witnessed the tail end of the interaction. She had been watching Brandon since he first boarded, noting his dismissive treatment of the gate agents and flight crew, and she could see that Sophia's instincts about potential problems were proving accurate. As a trainee, Maria was supposed to observe and learn from experienced crew members, but she was also documenting passenger interactions as part of her development program. She made a discreet note about the seating conflict and Brandon's reaction, adding it to her growing file of observations about passenger behavior patterns. The flight was now fully boarded, and Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom with the standard departure announcements. But in row 12, the tension was just beginning to build. Brandon had claimed both armrests with the territorial aggression of someone marking his domain, and his laptop was positioned in such a way that it encroached significantly on Amara's limited space. Every few minutes he would shift position, sigh loudly, or make small comments under his breath about inconsiderate passengers and people who don't understand business travel. His phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, each notification accompanied by increasingly agitated responses. "This is ridiculous," he said during one particularly long phone conversation, his voice loud enough to disturb passengers several rows away. "I'm surrounded by people who have no idea how real business works." Amateur hour from top to bottom. Amara continued reading her book, a biography of aviation pioneers, while mentally cataloging each microaggression and boundary violation. As someone who had built a billion-dollar company from scratch, she understood exactly how real business worked. But she was fascinated by Brandon's need to establish dominance over strangers, who posed no threat to his professional success. Robert Martinez found himself caught between his natural inclination to avoid conflict and his growing disgust at Brandon's behavior. As a contractor, he had worked with all types of personalities, but he had rarely encountered someone so openly contemptuous of basic courtesy. His military father had taught him that real strength was displayed through self-control and consideration for others, not through bullying people who couldn't fight back. Lisa Thompson, still recording discreetly from the row behind, had already uploaded several short clips to her Instagram stories with captions like, "Business class behavior in premium economy," and "When your frequent flyer status goes to your head." Her followers were beginning to respond with comments and questions, sensing that something interesting was developing. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, none of the passengers in row 12 realized that they were sitting at the epicenter of what would become a viral phenomenon. Brandon was still convinced that he was dealing with ordinary people who would eventually recognize his superiority. Amara was quietly gathering intelligence about competitor service and passenger dynamics. Robert was hoping the flight would improve once they were airborne. But the worst was yet to come. In less than an hour, Brandon's true character would emerge in ways that would shock even the passengers who had already witnessed his entitled behavior. And when that happened, the quiet woman in the middle seat would reveal exactly why his attitude was about to cost him everything he had spent his career building. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the countdown to Brandon Mitchell's destruction had officially begun. The first hour of Flight 447 was a masterclass in passive-aggressive behavior delivered by Brandon Mitchell, with the precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of making other people miserable without technically breaking any rules. He had appropriated both armrests with the territorial confidence of a colonial flag, planting his elbows positioned just aggressively enough to crowd Amara's space without giving her grounds for a direct complaint. His laptop, a top-of-the-line machine emblazoned with the Technova corporate logo, was angled in such a way that its sharp corner continuously brushed against Amara's arm whenever she shifted position. When she politely asked if he could adjust the screen slightly, he responded with an exaggerated sigh and moved it precisely 1 inch enough to demonstrate compliance without actually solving the problem. "Some people," he muttered under his breath loud enough for both Amara and Robert to hear, "just don't understand the realities of business travel." Amara, for her part, simply tucked her arm closer to her body and continued reading. Her calm response seemed to fuel Brandon's irritation like oxygen feeding a fire. He was accustomed to getting reactions from people, anger, frustration, submission, but this woman's serene indifference to his provocations was maddening. It was like trying to pick a fight with water. The meal service began with Sophia and Maria working their way down the cabin with practiced efficiency. As they approached row 12, Sophia was already mentally prepared for potential complications. Her interactions with Brandon during boarding had established him as a passenger who viewed service workers as props in his personal drama rather than human beings deserving of basic courtesy. "Good afternoon, folks," Sophia said with her professional smile. "Our meal choices today are pan-seared salmon with asparagus and lemon risotto or wild mushroom and truffle pasta with seasonal vegetables." "I'll have the salmon," Brandon said immediately, then gestured toward Amara without looking at her. "And I'm sure she'll be happy with the pasta." The presumption was breathtaking in its casual arrogance. He had not only ordered for himself, but had decided what was appropriate for the woman sitting next to him, as if her preferences were subject to his approval and her choices were his to make. Amara met Sophia's eyes, and a flicker of understanding passed between them. In that moment, Sophia recognized that she was witnessing something more than ordinary passenger rudeness. This was a deliberate power play, an attempt to establish dominance through the simple act of removing another person's agency to make their own decisions. "I'll have the salmon as well, please," Amara said, using Sophia's name with the natural courtesy that Brandon had never once displayed. "Thank you." Sophia's smile became more genuine. "Of course. 2 salmon dinners for row 12. Brandon scoffed loud enough to be heard by passengers 2 rows away. "Unbelievable. Some people just have to make everything difficult." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Passengers around them began to shift uncomfortably, realizing that they were witnessing something beyond normal travel friction. Robert Martinez, trapped in the window seat, found his hands clenching involuntarily as his patience with Brandon's behavior approached its limit. Behind them, Lisa Thompson had transitioned from discreet recording to active documentation. Her Instagram stories were now attracting real-time comments from followers who were invested in seeing how the situation would unfold. "This guy is unreal," she typed as a caption. "Stay tuned because this is getting ugly." The meal service continued, with Brandon treating every interaction as an opportunity to demonstrate his superiority. He critiqued the temperature of his food, complained about the wine selection, and made pointed comments about the declining standards of airline service, all while Sophia and Maria maintained their professional composure with remarkable grace. "You know," Brandon said loudly during his 3rd glass of wine, "I remember when airlines actually cared about their premium passengers. Now they let just anyone into these cabins, and the service suffers accordingly." Maria, who was collecting empty plates, paused briefly at his words. As a young Latina woman working in customer service, she had heard variations of this sentiment throughout her career, but never quite so blatantly expressed. Sophia, noticing her protégé's reaction, stepped in smoothly. "I hope you'll let us know if there's anything specific we can do to improve your experience today, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice perfectly professional despite the tightness around her eyes. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean," Brandon replied, his words slightly slurred from the wine. "Some people just don't belong in premium cabins. It brings down the whole experience for the rest of us." The statement was clearly intended for Amara, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who believed his frequent flyer status granted him the right to police who deserved quality service. But Brandon had miscalculated the effect his words would have on the other passengers who were listening. Robert Martinez, who had been holding his tongue for over an hour, finally spoke up. "Excuse me, sir, but I think you're out of line." Brandon turned toward the window seat with genuine surprise. In his worldview, other passengers were supposed to be invisible audience members to his performance, not active participants who might challenge his behavior. "I'm sorry, did I ask for your opinion?" Brandon said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I was having a conversation with the flight attendant about service standards." "No," Robert said, his voice steady but firm. "You were being rude to a fellow passenger who has done nothing but mind her own business. That's not about service standards. That's about basic human decency." The confrontation attracted the attention of passengers throughout the premium economy cabin. Conversations quieted, electronic devices were lowered, and dozens of eyes focused on row 12. Lisa Thompson, sensing that the moment was escalating, began live streaming directly to her Instagram account. "Ladies and gentlemen," she whispered to her phone camera, "we are witnessing something incredible on American Airlines Flight 447. This businessman has been harassing a fellow passenger for over an hour, and people are finally starting to speak up." Brandon, realizing that he was now the center of unwanted attention, felt his carefully constructed image of sophisticated authority beginning to crumble. The alcohol, the stress of his upcoming business deal, and his fundamental inability to handle contradiction had combined into a perfect storm of poor judgment. "Look," he said, his voice rising to address not just Robert, but anyone else who might be listening. "I don't know what kind of social justice warrior nonsense you people think this is, but I pay for premium service and I expect premium passengers. Some people just don't understand the difference." The words "you people" landed like a slap across the cabin. The phrase carried generations of coded language and deliberate exclusion, and everyone present recognized its implications. Brandon had crossed the line from rudeness into territory that was far more dangerous and revealing. Amara, who had remained silent throughout the escalating confrontation, finally closed her book and looked directly at Brandon. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but carried easily through the now silent cabin. "Mr. Mitchell, what exactly do you mean by some people? I'd like you to be more specific." The challenge was delivered with surgical precision. Brandon had been making increasingly obvious references to race class and social status for over an hour, but he had been careful to use coded language that gave him plausible deniability. Now Amara was forcing him to either clarify his meaning or back down from his implications. Brandon, emboldened by wine and convinced of his own righteousness, made the decision that would destroy his life. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, pointing directly at Amara. "People like you who probably got their tickets through some diversity program or affirmative action nonsense, who think they deserve the same treatment as passengers who actually earn their status through hard work and business success." The silence that followed was deafening. Brandon had not only revealed his racial bias, but had done so in front of dozens of witnesses, many of whom were now recording the interaction. Lisa Thompson's live stream had attracted over 500 viewers in real time, and the number was climbing rapidly as people shared the feed across social media platforms. Sophia, who had been trained to handle difficult passengers, but had never encountered anything quite this blatant, reached for the call button that would alert the cockpit. This situation had moved far beyond ordinary customer service challenges and into territory that required intervention from the flight's captain. "Sir," she said, her voice still professional but now carrying an edge of authority, "I need you to lower your voice and return to your seat immediately." Brandon laughed, a harsh sound that carried no humor. "My seat, lady. I am in my seat. And I'll speak to whoever I want, however I want. That's what first-class service means." "This is premium economy, sir," Maria said quietly, immediately regretting speaking when Brandon's attention turned toward her like a predator focusing on new prey. "Did I ask you?" he snarled. "Maybe you should worry less about correcting customers and more about improving the service quality. Though I suppose standards have dropped pretty much everywhere these days." The attack on Maria was the final straw for several passengers. Robert Martinez unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, his considerable frame casting a shadow over Brandon's seat. Behind them, other passengers were also rising, their faces reflecting the disgust and anger that had been building throughout the flight. But Amara remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap, watching Brandon destroy himself with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. She had seen men like him before. Executives who believed their success gave them the right to diminish others who mistook cruelty for strength and prejudice for business acumen. What Brandon didn't know was that every word he had spoken was being documented not just by fellow passengers, but by the CEO of a company that held millions of dollars of his employer's travel contracts. His casual racism and deliberate cruelty weren't just character flaws, they were about to become evidence in the lawsuit that was already building against Technova. And in less than 30 minutes, when Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit to address the disruption, Amara Williams would finally reveal exactly who she was and why Brandon Mitchell had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. The countdown to consequences had begun, and Brandon was too drunk on his own arrogance to realize that his career was about to implode at 35,000 feet. Brandon Mitchell stood up in the narrow aisle of the aircraft with the unsteady confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. The wine had loosened his tongue and amplified his sense of grievance, transforming what might have been private prejudices into a public performance of toxic masculinity and racial bias. "You know what?" he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the premium economy cabin as he addressed the passengers around him. "I think everyone needs to understand what's really happening here. This woman," he pointed directly at Amara, "has been trying to provoke me since we boarded. She's probably recording everything for some lawsuit planning to play the victim card for a quick payday." The accusation was so divorced from reality that several passengers gasped audibly. For over an hour they had watched Brandon escalate from rudeness to overt hostility, while Amara sat quietly reading her book, responding only when directly addressed and never raising her voice or making any demands. "That's completely false," Robert Martinez said, his voice shaking with anger. "This woman has been nothing but polite while you've been acting like a complete— Stay out of this, Roberto." Brandon interrupted his words, deliberate and calculated to wound. "You people always stick together, don't you? Always quick to gang up on successful Americans who've actually earned their place in the world." The racial slur hit the cabin like a physical blow. The phrase "you people" followed by the implication that anyone who wasn't white hadn't earned their place was so blatantly racist that even passengers who had been trying to ignore the situation could no longer pretend they weren't witnessing something extraordinary. Lisa Thompson's live stream exploded with comments and shares as viewers recognized they were watching real-time documentation of workplace discrimination in action. Her follower count climbed rapidly as people shared the feed, and major social media platforms began picking up clips of Brandon's increasingly unhinged behavior. "Sir, you need to sit down immediately," Sophia said, her professional composure finally cracking slightly. As lead flight attendant, she had dealt with difficult passengers, medical emergencies, and mechanical problems, but she had never encountered such blatant racism delivered with such casual confidence. Brandon laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the cabin. "I'll sit down when I'm ready to sit down, and I'll speak to whoever I want, however I want. That's what happens when you actually pay for your ticket instead of getting charity handouts." Behind the scenes, Sophia's call button had already alerted the cockpit to a developing situation. Captain Elena Rodriguez was monitoring the conversation through the aircraft's internal communication system, and she was preparing to leave the cockpit for the first time during the flight. Captain Rodriguez had seen combat zones, emergency landings, and life-threatening situations, but she had zero tolerance for passengers who turned her aircraft into a platform for hate speech. Her military background had taught her that teams functioned best when every member was treated with dignity and respect, and she applied the same principles to civilian aviation. "What seems to be the problem here?" Captain Rodriguez's voice cut through the cabin tension like a blade as she emerged from the cockpit. Her pilot's uniform carried an authority that even Brandon couldn't ignore, and her expression made clear that she was not interested in diplomatic solutions. Brandon, still convinced that authority figures would naturally side with a successful businessman over ordinary passengers, immediately began his performance. "Captain, thank God you're here. This passenger," he gestured toward Amara, "has been causing problems since we boarded. She's been harassing me, probably trying to set up some discrimination claim for money." Captain Rodriguez looked at Amara, who remained seated with her book closed in her lap. then at Brandon, who was swaying slightly in the aisle with wine on his breath and aggression written across his face. "Ma'am," the captain said to Amara, "is there a problem here?" Amara's response was measured and calm. "No, Captain. Just some turbulence. Nothing I can't handle." The metaphor was perfect and pointed. She had described Brandon's behavior as whether a temporary disturbance that was unpleasant but manageable. The implication was clear. She had dealt with men like him before, and she wasn't intimidated by his tantrum. Brandon, completely missing the subtlety of the exchange, exploded. "Turbulence. She's the turbulence. These people are always the problem, always looking for someone to blame for their failures, always." "Mr. Mitchell." Captain Rodriguez interrupted her voice, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "Return to your seat immediately, or this aircraft will be making an unscheduled landing." But Brandon was too far gone to recognize the warning. The alcohol, the stress of his business deal, and his fundamental inability to accept contradiction had combined into a perfect storm of poor judgment and racial animus. "You know what he said?" His voice rising to address the entire cabin. "I am sick and tired of this political correctness nonsense. I spend $300,000 a year with this airline. I know the CEO personally. One phone call from me can have all of you fired, starting with whatever diversity hire program put her in this cabin." He pointed at Amara again, his finger shaking with rage. "People like her don't belong in premium economy. Hell, people like her don't belong on airplanes at all. They should be grateful for bus service." The statement was so viciously racist that several passengers began reaching for their phones to call airline customer service immediately. Lisa Thompson's live stream had now attracted over 3,000 real-time viewers, and clips of Brandon's rant were being shared across every major social media platform. But it was the next statement that would destroy Brandon's life completely. "I'll say whatever I want to, whoever I want," he declared, his voice carrying the drunken confidence of someone who believed his money made him untouchable. "And there's not a damn thing any of you people can do about it." Amara Williams stood up slowly, her movement so controlled and deliberate that the entire cabin fell silent. For over an hour she had remained seated while Brandon revealed the depth of his prejudice and cruelty. Now finally she was ready to respond. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying easily through the silent aircraft, "there is something I can do about it." Brandon, emboldened by what he interpreted as a challenge from someone he considered powerless, took a step closer. "Oh, really? And what exactly do you think you can do to me? Call your lawyer? File a complaint? Do you have any idea who I am? Do you know what kind of influence I have in this industry?" Amara reached into her purse and pulled out her business card holder, extracting a single card and holding it where Brandon could see it clearly. "Dr. Amara Williams," she said quietly, "founder and chief executive officer, Skybridge Airlines." The words hit Brandon like a physical blow. His face went white as the blood drained from his cheeks, and he actually staggered backward as the implications began to register in his alcohol-fogged brain. "Your company's largest corporate travel client." Amara continued, her voice remaining calm, even as she delivered what amounted to a professional death sentence. $12 million in annual revenue, all of which flows through Skybridge's corporate booking platform. The cabin erupted in gasps, exclamations, and the sound of dozens of passengers sharing the revelation in real time across social media. Lisa Thompson's live stream exploded as viewers realized they were witnessing not just a racist meltdown, but the moment when that racism collided with consequences in the most dramatic way possible. Brandon's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as his world collapsed around him. The woman he had spent an hour humiliating and degrading was not just another passenger. She was the CEO of a major airline and, more importantly, the person who controlled millions of dollars of his company's travel budget. That's impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of passenger commentary and social media alerts. "You can't be. You're just—" Just what Mr. Mitchell Amara asked her question, cutting through his stammering like a scalpel. "Just what did you think I was?" The question hung in the air, forcing Brandon to confront the racist assumptions that had driven his behavior for the entire flight. In trying to answer, he would have to articulate exactly why he had assumed she didn't belong in premium economy, why he had felt entitled to order her food for her, why he had dismissed her preferences and insulted her character. And in that moment of forced reflection, with hundreds of thousands of people watching through social media live streams, Brandon Mitchell finally understood that his career, his reputation, and his future had just been destroyed by his own words, broadcast live to the world by the very technology that he had thought made him untouchable. The reckoning had arrived, and there would be no escape from the consequences of his choices. The business card seemed to glow in Amara's hand as she held it at eye level, allowing Brandon and the surrounding passengers to read every detail clearly. Dr. Amara Williams, founder and CEO, Skybridge Airlines, was embossed in elegant silver lettering, along with contact information that any aviation industry professional would immediately recognize as legitimate. Brandon stared at the card as if it might transform into something else if he looked hard enough. His brain, clouded by alcohol and adrenaline, struggled to process information that completely contradicted everything he had assumed about the quiet woman he had been tormenting for over an hour. Skybridge. He repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. You're the CEO of the fastest-growing airline in North America. Amara confirmed, her tone remaining conversational despite the magnitude of the revelation. And more importantly for you, Mr. Mitchell, the company that handles Technova's entire corporate travel program. The color drained from Brandon's face as the implications began to cascade through his consciousness. Technova's $12 million annual travel budget, the contracts he had personally negotiated, the elite status benefits that came with that relationship, the corporate discounts that made his own frequent travel possible. All of it flowed through the company owned by the woman he had just called inferior, undeserving, and worse. $12 million in annual revenue. Amara continued, pulling out her phone with deliberate precision. All of which I have the authority to cancel with a single phone call. Lisa Thompson's live stream erupted with comments as viewers realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The hashtag #justice@30,000 began trending across multiple platforms as people shared clips of Brandon's racist rant, followed by the stunning revelation of Amara's identity. Wait, Brandon said, his voice cracking with desperation. Wait, you can't. This is entrapment. You set me up. You deliberately sat in coach to premium economy, Amara corrected gently. And yes, I often travel on competitor airlines to study customer service standards. It's called market research, Mr. Mitchell. I'm sure Technova conducts similar competitive intelligence in your industry. Sophia Ramirez, who had been watching the exchange with growing amazement, finally spoke up. Dr. Williams. You're the doctor. Williams. I read about you in Aviation Week. You revolutionized corporate travel booking. Amara smiled warmly at the flight attendant, the first genuine smile she had displayed since boarding. Thank you, Sophia. And I have to say your professionalism throughout this incident has been exemplary. You'll be hearing from Skybridge's Human Resources Department about potential opportunities. The comment sent another wave of gasps through the cabin as passengers realized that they weren't just witnessing the destruction of Brandon's career, but the potential elevation of the flight attendants who had handled his abuse with grace and dignity. Brandon, meanwhile, was experiencing the kind of panic that comes with watching one's life implode in real time. His hands shook as he reached for his phone, desperately trying to call his assistant, his boss, anyone who might help him navigate the disaster he had created. "Marcus," he said into the phone, his voice high and strained. "Marcus, I need you to... There's been a situation. I need to speak to David immediately. It's about the Skybridge contract." But even as he spoke, Amara was having her own conversation. "Sarah," she said to her assistant, "I need you to cancel the Technova corporate contract immediately. Full termination effective today. Also, please prepare a statement for the press regarding our company's zero-tolerance policy for discrimination." The phone call was brief, professional, and devastating. Within minutes, Technova would lose not just their travel booking platform, but their preferred rates corporate discounts and priority customer service. The financial impact would be immediate and substantial. "You can't do this," Brandon said, ending his own call as he realized that his assistant couldn't reach anyone at Technova headquarters. "This is business suicide. We're one of your biggest clients." "You were one of our biggest clients," Amara corrected. Past tense. As of right now, Technova is welcome to book individual tickets at standard retail prices like any other customer. Captain Rodriguez, who had been listening to the exchange with professional interest, stepped forward. "Dr. Williams, I apologize for this incident. This is not the standard of passenger behavior that American Airlines tolerates. I understand, Captain. And I want you to know that this incident reflects on Mr. Mitchell alone, not on your crew or your airline." Sophia and her team handled an impossible situation with remarkable professionalism. The praise for American Airlines crew delivered by the CEO of a competing airline demonstrated a level of class and industry respect that made Brandon's behavior look even more petty and unprofessional by comparison. Other passengers were now openly filming and sharing the interaction across social media. Robert Martinez had pulled out his phone to document the conversation, while Lisa Thompson's live stream had attracted over 5,000 real-time viewers. Comments poured in from around the world as people shared the story of the racist businessman who had unknowingly destroyed his career by attacking his own company's most important travel partner. "This has to be the most epic corporate karma I've ever seen," one commenter wrote. "This dude literally ended his own career on live TV." Brandon made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Dr. Williams, I was under stress. I've been drinking. I didn't mean those things I said. Surely we can work something out, businessman to businessman." Amara looked at him with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so cold. "Mr. Mitchell, you've shown me exactly who you are when you think there are no consequences for your actions. A man who orders food for women without asking their preferences. A man who uses racial slurs when he's frustrated. A man who believes his money gives him the right to diminish other human beings." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the final blow. "That's not stress, Mr. Mitchell. That's character. And your character has just cost Technova $12 million in annual revenue along with whatever additional business they lose when this video goes viral." As if summoned by her words, Brandon's phone began buzzing with calls, texts, and notifications. Social media alerts, news outlets requesting comment, and most ominously a call from Technova's CEO that he was too terrified to answer. "The discrimination lawsuit filed against your company this morning just became the least of Technova's problems," Amara continued. "By tomorrow, every major corporation in America will know exactly what kind of executives Technova employs and what kind of behavior your company culture tolerates." The prediction was already coming true. Lisa Thompson's live stream had been picked up by major news outlets, and clips of Brandon's racist rants were being shared millions of times across social media platforms. Brandon Mitchell was trending nationwide, but not in the way he had ever imagined his name might become famous. Captain Rodriguez made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making our descent into Los Angeles ahead of schedule. Please return to your seats and prepare for landing." But for Brandon Mitchell, landing in Los Angeles wouldn't mark the end of his journey. It would mark the beginning of a very different life than the one he had boarded with that morning. His career, His reputation and his future had been destroyed by his own words, witnessed by millions, and there would be no recovery from the consequences he had brought upon himself. As the aircraft began its descent, Amara returned to her seat and reopened her book, while Brandon sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that the woman he had tried to humiliate had just humiliated him in return. But unlike his cruelty, her response had been measured professional and entirely justified. The reckoning was complete, and the consequences were only beginning. The descent into Los Angeles International Airport felt like a countdown to Judgment Day for Brandon Mitchell. Every minute that passed brought new notifications to his phone, missed calls from his boss, urgent text messages from colleagues, and social media alerts that showed his racist rant spreading across the internet at viral speed. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom with an announcement that sent chills down Brandon's spine. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a passenger incident that occurred during our flight, will be met at the gate by airport security and federal agents. All passengers will be required to provide contact information before deplaning. We apologize for any inconvenience." The words federal agents hit Brandon like a physical blow. What had started as a personal humiliation was rapidly escalating into something that could involve federal hate crime investigations, corporate liability, and criminal charges. Lisa Thompson's live stream had exploded beyond anything she had ever experienced. Her follower count had jumped by over 50,000 in the past hour, and major news outlets were reaching out for interviews and exclusive content rights. The hashtag #JusticeAt30,000 was trending in multiple countries, and celebrities were already weighing in with support for Dr. Williams and condemnation of Brandon's behavior. "This is unprecedented," Lisa whispered to her phone camera as the plane descended. "I've been documenting travel content for 5 years, and I've never seen anything like this." This man literally destroyed his own life in real time, and millions of people watched it happen. Meanwhile, Dr. Amara Williams was conducting a series of calm professional phone calls that were methodically dismantling Technova's business relationships. Her conversations were brief, factual, and devastating in their implications. "David," she said to her chief operating officer, "I need you to contact our legal team about the Technova situation. We have clear documentation of discriminatory behavior from one of their senior executives, and I want to make sure we're protected if they try to challenge the contract termination." Already on it came the response through her phone speaker. "Our lawyers are reviewing the contract language now. Given the moral turpitude clauses we included, they have no grounds for legal action. Also, the press is calling. How do you want to handle media requests? Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning. I want to address this publicly and make it clear that Skybridge has zero tolerance for discrimination in any form." Each phone call was another nail in Technova's corporate coffin. Word was already spreading through the business aviation community about Brandon's behavior, and other airlines were reconsidering their relationships with Technova. Corporate travel is built on trust and relationships, and both had just been shattered beyond repair. Brandon, listening to these conversations with growing horror, made increasingly desperate attempts to reach his own corporate contacts. But his calls were going straight to voicemail, his text messages were being ignored, and his LinkedIn notifications showed that people were already distancing themselves from his professional profile. Sir Sofia Ramirez said, approaching his seat with professional courtesy, "Despite everything that had happened, airport security will need to speak with you when we land. I recommend that you cooperate fully and consider legal representation." The advice was delivered with the kind of professional concern that highlighted just how serious Brandon's situation had become. Flight attendants didn't typically recommend lawyers unless criminal charges were a real possibility. As the aircraft touched down and taxied toward the gate, passengers were already sharing footage and commentary across social media. Robert Martinez had filmed several clips that showed the contrast between Brandon's aggressive behavior and Amara's composed responses. His videos were being shared with captions like, "How to destroy your career in 10 easy steps," and "When privilege meets consequences." The gate area at LAX had been transformed into a media circus. News vans lined the tarmac, reporters waited in the terminal, and airport security had established a perimeter to manage the growing crowd of onlookers and journalists. The story had broken while the flight was still in the air, and every major news outlet in the country was scrambling to get exclusive coverage. Brandon's phone buzzed with a call from Technova's CEO, David Harrison. With trembling hands, he answered. "Brandon, what the hell did you do?" Harrison's voice was barely controlled fury. "I've got reporters calling me about racist rants, viral videos, and contract cancellations. Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding." "David, I can explain." "No, stop talking. Don't say another word. I've seen the videos. All of them. Multiple angles, perfect audio quality, millions of views. There is no explanation for what you said on that plane." The line went quiet for a moment before Harrison continued. "Your employment with Technova is terminated immediately. Security is clearing out your office as we speak. Your corporate accounts are frozen, your company car is being repossessed, and you're banned from all Technova facilities permanently." The words hit Brandon like physical blows. 20 years of building his career, climbing the corporate ladder, accumulating wealth and status, all of it erased by a single conversation at 35,000 feet. "David, please, you can't. I can and I am. What's worse, Brandon, is that you've destroyed relationships that took us years to build. Skybridge was one of our most valuable partnerships, and now they won't even take our calls. Other vendors are already asking questions about our company culture. You haven't just ended your career, you've damaged our entire organization." As passengers began deplaning, they were directed to a separate area where FBI agents and airport security were conducting interviews about the incident. The federal response had been triggered by reports of potential hate crime violations and airline safety concerns related to discriminatory behavior. Dr. Amara Williams was among the first passengers interviewed, and her testimony was precise, factual, and damning. She had documented everything: the time of each incident, the specific language used, the escalation pattern, and the impact on other passengers and crew members. Mr. Mitchell's behavior created a hostile environment that affected the safety and comfort of everyone in that cabin, she told the agents. His language was explicitly racist, his actions were deliberately intimidating, and his statements about who belongs on aircraft could constitute violations of federal civil rights laws. When Brandon's turn came for questioning, he was accompanied by an airport-provided legal advocate who had advised him to remain silent. But the damage was already done. Hours of video evidence, dozens of witness testimonies, and a digital trail of social media documentation had created an unshakable case against him. By the time passengers were released from the airport, Brandon Mitchell was the top trending topic in the United States. His full name, his company affiliation, and his professional background had been shared millions of times. Employment attorneys were analyzing his case on cable news. Civil rights organizations were calling for federal investigations, and comedy shows were already preparing segments about the man who destroyed his career by insulting the one person who could actually end it. Technova's stock price had dropped 8% in after-hours trading as investors reacted to news of the discrimination scandal and the loss of major corporate contracts. The company's board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss damage control and legal liability. Meanwhile, Dr. Amara Williams walked through LAX with quiet dignity, declined multiple interview requests, and issued a simple statement through her public relations team. Skybridge Airlines maintains zero tolerance for discrimination in any form. We are proud to serve all travelers regardless of their background, and we will continue to hold ourselves and our business partners to the highest standards of professional conduct. The statement was measured professional and devastatingly effective. By morning, it would be quoted in every major news outlet in the country, and Amara Williams would be hailed as a role model for business leadership and quiet strength. Brandon Mitchell, meanwhile, walked out of LAX as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked privilege and casual racism. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed, and his actions had created consequences that would ripple through the business world for years to come. The flight that was supposed to take him to the biggest deal of his career had instead delivered him to the biggest disaster of his life. And unlike turbulence, this was one kind of rough air that he would never be able to fly through. 6 months after Flight 447, the reverberations of Brandon Mitchell's public meltdown continued to reshape both the aviation industry and the broader corporate landscape. What had started as one man's racist outburst had evolved into a landmark case study in accountability, social media justice, and the power of authentic leadership. Dr. Amara Williams stood before the Congressional Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure delivering testimony that would influence federal policy on airline passenger rights and discrimination prevention. The hearing room was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and industry executives, all listening as she outlined the widespread nature of discrimination in air travel. The incident on Flight 447 was not an isolated case. She testified, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had built a billion-dollar company while fighting prejudice every step of the way. My company receives dozens of reports monthly from passengers who experience discrimination based on race, religion, gender, or perceived economic status. The aviation industry has a responsibility to ensure that air travel is safe and dignified for all Americans. The committee chair, Congresswoman Maria Santos, no relation to the flight attendant, leaned forward with interest. Dr. Williams, what specific changes would you recommend to prevent future incidents like the one you experienced? First, mandatory bias training for all airline personnel, including third-party contractors and frequent business travelers who represent corporate accounts. Second, federal whistleblower protections for employees who report discriminatory behavior. Third, standardized incident reporting that creates accountability for airlines that fail to address patterns of bias. The recommendations carried significant weight because they came from someone who had experienced discrimination firsthand, but had responded with policy solutions rather than just criticism. Amara's approach, combining personal experience with business expertise, had made her a powerful voice in the movement for transportation equity. Meanwhile, the consequences for Technova Corporation had been swift and devastating. Beyond losing the Skybridge contract, they had faced a cascade of business relationship terminations as other companies sought to distance themselves from the scandal. Their corporate travel costs had increased by 40% as they were forced to book at retail rates without preferred partnerships. The discrimination lawsuit that had been filed on the morning of Flight 447 had evolved into a class action case involving over 200 former and current employees. Internal emails and recorded conversations had revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior that went far beyond Brandon's public meltdown, exposing a corporate culture that had tolerated and sometimes encouraged bias. Technova's board had responded by implementing a complete leadership overhaul. The CEO who had hired Brandon was forced to resign along with 3 other senior executives who had been implicated in creating the toxic workplace environment. The company had spent over $50 million on legal settlements, diversity consultants, and reputation management efforts. The Brandon Mitchell incident was a wake-up call for our entire industry, said Jennifer Roberts, Technova's new CEO, during her first major interview since taking over the company. We've learned that corporate culture isn't something that happens by accident. It's something that must be deliberately cultivated and constantly maintained. Roberts, an African-American executive with a track record of building inclusive organizations, had been brought in specifically to rebuild Technova's reputation. Her first acts had included firing all executives who had been involved in discriminatory practices, implementing mandatory bias training for every employee, and establishing an independent committee to investigate and address workplace complaints. The personal cost to Brandon Mitchell had been total and irreversible. His termination from Technova had been followed by industry-wide blacklisting as other companies refused to hire someone whose racist behavior had been documented and shared millions of times. His expensive lifestyle had collapsed along with his income, leading to divorce proceedings. The loss of his home and social isolation as friends and colleagues distanced themselves from his toxic reputation. Employment attorneys had analyzed his case on national television, concluding that his termination was not only legal, but necessary to protect Technova from further liability. Mr. Mitchell created a hostile work environment that extended beyond the workplace, one legal expert explained. When employees represent their companies in public, their behavior becomes a reflection of corporate values. No company can afford to employ someone whose actions expose them to federal civil rights violations. But the story had positive heroes as well as a cautionary villain. Sofia Ramirez had been promoted to American Airlines' corporate training department, where she was helping develop new protocols for handling discrimination incidents. Her calm, professional response to Brandon's behavior had become a training video used by airlines worldwide. Sofia's handling of that situation was textbook crisis management, said Marcus Johnson, American Airlines Vice President of Customer Experience. She protected the safety and dignity of all passengers while documenting everything for follow-up action. That's exactly the kind of leadership we want to cultivate throughout our organization. Maria Santos, the junior flight attendant, had been offered a full scholarship to pursue her MBA through a program established by Dr. Amara Williams specifically for service industry workers who demonstrated exceptional professionalism under pressure. The scholarship program had quickly expanded to include dozens of recipients from airlines, hotels, and other hospitality companies. Lisa Thompson's documentation of the incident had launched her career as a social justice advocate and citizen journalist. Her Instagram following had grown to over 3 million, and she had parlayed her viral moment into a platform for highlighting discrimination in travel hospitality and other service industries. Major networks regularly consulted her for commentary on workplace bias and the power of social media accountability. The Brandon Mitchell incident showed that ordinary people have extraordinary power to document injustice and demand accountability, she said during a TED Talk that had been viewed over 10 million times. But it also showed that real change comes from institutions and leaders who are willing to act on that documentation. Robert Martinez had become an unexpected advocate for bystander intervention training. His decision to speak up during Brandon's rant had been featured in corporate training programs as an example of how witness testimony could support victims of discrimination. "I regret that I didn't speak up sooner," he said during a diversity conference presentation. "But I learned that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and all of us have a responsibility to create environments where discrimination isn't tolerated." Perhaps most significantly, Dr. Amara Williams had used the incident as a catalyst for industry-wide change. Skybridge Airlines had partnered with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Anti-Defamation League to create the Travel Equity Initiative, a program that monitored discrimination in transportation and provided legal support for victims of bias. The initiative had already documented over 500 cases of discrimination across the aviation industry, leading to policy changes, employee terminations, and federal investigations. Airlines that participated in the program received preferred vendor status with Skybridge's corporate booking platform, creating financial incentives for companies to address bias proactively. Accountability isn't just about punishing bad actors, Amara explained during the program's launch. It's about creating environments where good actors are rewarded and discrimination becomes economically unsustainable. The long-term impact of Flight 447 had extended far beyond aviation. Business schools were teaching the incident as a case study in crisis management, corporate accountability, and the importance of authentic leadership. The hashtag #JusticeAt30,000 feet had become a rallying cry for workplace equity advocates across multiple industries. Federal legislation inspired by the incident was working its way through Congress, proposing enhanced penalties for discrimination in transportation and stronger protections for employees who reported bias. The bill, formerly known as the Transportation Equity Act, but commonly called the Flight 447 Bill, had bipartisan support and was expected to become law within the year. For Dr. Amara Williams, the incident had reinforced her belief that business success and social responsibility were not competing interests, but complementary imperatives. Skybridge Airlines had grown by 30% in the 6 months following the incident as corporations sought to partner with companies that demonstrated clear commitments to equity and inclusion. The Flight 447 incident taught me that leadership isn't just about building profitable businesses, she reflected during her congressional testimony. It's about using whatever platform you have to make the world more fair, more just, and more dignified for everyone. As she concluded her remarks and stepped down from the witness table, Amara carried with her the knowledge that one terrible encounter had been transformed into lasting change. Brandon Mitchell's moment of revealed character had created consequences that would protect future travelers from similar treatment, and sometimes that was how progress worked. One awful example that became a catalyst for something better. 2 years after Flight 447, Dr. Amara Williams received a letter that she almost didn't open. The return address showed a small community college in Ohio, and the handwritten envelope seemed unremarkable among the corporate correspondence and speaking invitations that typically filled her mail. But the letter inside was from Brandon Mitchell. "Dr. Williams," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you choose not to read this, but I wanted you to know that losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though it took me 2 years to understand why." The letter went on to describe Brandon's journey from corporate executive to community college instructor, where he now taught business ethics courses for students pursuing their first degrees later in life. Many of his students were immigrants, veterans, and working parents, people whose backgrounds he would have dismissed during his Technova days. "I teach my students about the Flight 447 incident as an example of how unchecked privilege and prejudice can destroy not just careers, but souls," he wrote. "I don't tell them I was the man in the video until the end of the semester after they've learned to recognize the warning signs of discrimination and the importance of speaking up when they witness injustice." He described his work with a nonprofit organization that provided job training for formerly incarcerated individuals, many of whom had been victims of the same prejudicial thinking that had shaped his worldview for decades. His salary was a fraction of what he had earned at Technova, but his letter suggested a man who had found purpose beyond profit. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," the letter concluded. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that your dignity in the face of my cruelty showed me what real strength looks like. You could have destroyed me with anger, but instead you destroyed my ignorance with grace. Thank you for that lesson." Dr. Williams read the letter twice, then placed it in her desk drawer next to other correspondence that had shaped her understanding of accountability, redemption, and the complex ways that people could change when faced with genuine consequences. Skybridge Airlines had become the second largest carrier in North America, known not just for its operational excellence, but for its unwavering commitment to creating inclusive environments for passengers and employees. The Travel Equity Initiative had expanded internationally, and airports around the world displayed plaques recognizing Dr. Williams's contributions to civil rights in transportation. The Flight 447 incident had been featured in documentaries, academic studies, and corporate training programs used by thousands of companies worldwide. But for Amara, the most meaningful outcome was simpler. Airlines had become safer and more welcoming places for travelers who might once have been targets of discrimination. As she returned to her work reviewing plans for Skybridge's expansion into sustainable aviation fuels, Dr. Amara Williams reflected on the strange journey that had brought a moment of ugliness at 35,000 feet into something approaching redemption. Real power, she had learned, wasn't about crushing enemies or extracting revenge. It was about using strength to lift others up and create institutions that protected the vulnerable from those who would diminish them. Outside her office window, Skybridge aircraft departed for destinations around the world carrying passengers who traveled with the confidence that their dignity would be respected regardless of their background, appearance, or status. That was Brandon Mitchell's true legacy. Not the destruction of one man's career, but the protection of countless travelers who would never know how much safer their journeys had become because someone had finally said enough to discrimination in the skies. If you've ever witnessed injustice and wondered whether speaking up makes a difference, remember Flight 447. Remember that dignity is not determined by your seat assignment, your clothes, or your bank account. Remember that real change happens when good people refuse to remain silent in the face of cruelty. And remember that the most powerful response to hate is not more hate, but the quiet strength that comes from knowing your worth cannot be diminished by someone else's ignorance. This story proves that karma is real, that justice can happen, and that sometimes the person you choose to disrespect might be the very person who has the power to change your life forever. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, then I need you to do 3 things right now. First, smash that like button to show your support for stories about real justice and accountability. When we like and share content that celebrates equality and human dignity, we're telling the algorithm that these stories matter and need to be seen by more people. Second, subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell. We're committed to bringing you more stories about ordinary people who stood up to injustice, about karma catching up with bullies, and about the quiet heroes who make the world a better place, one interaction at a time. When you subscribe, you become part of a community that believes everyone deserves respect. Third, share this video with someone who needs to see it. Maybe it's someone who has experienced discrimination themselves. Maybe it's someone who has witnessed injustice, but wasn't sure whether speaking up would make a difference. Maybe it's someone who needs to be reminded that their actions have consequences, and that treating others with dignity isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Because in the end, we all share the same sky, and we all deserve to feel safe and respected while we're flying through it. Dr. Amara Williams showed us what true strength looks like. Not loud, not vengeful, but quiet, dignified, and absolutely powerful. Brandon Mitchell learned the hardest way possible that character is revealed when you think no one important is watching. But in today's world, everyone is always watching. Everyone is always recording, and everyone has the power to hold you accountable for your choices. Your voice matters. Your actions matter. And the way you treat others when you think it doesn't matter, that matters most of all.